Welcome everyone again to the Learning to Birth webinar series, where we interview some of the world's most interesting and inspiring thought leaders on birth and pregnancy. Today we have with us a wonderful guest, George C. Denniston. Welcome, George.
Welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Everyone, George is founder and president of the Doctors Opposing Circumcision organization. And also his background was as former associate medical director of Planned Parenthood Foundation in America. So we're really, really honored, George, that you're here with us today. Would you like to give us a little bit of background to your life story and how you came to be president and founder of such an important organization?
Well, yes, my whole career was spent controlling births. I realized as a young man that the population was about to explode, and I was hoping to see if I could stop that from happening, which of course didn't work, but we did our best. And as associate medical director of Planned Parenthood back in the 60s, I was able to get abortion and sterilization into all of the Planned Parenthoods in America, which was a lot of people were opposing at the time. That was my most successful activity I think I've ever in my whole life. Since then, I've run birth control clinics and became aware of this problem of circumcision some time ago, and felt that doctors were not listening to people who were not doctors, who knew more about this issue than they did. And so I decided we had to fight fire with fire, and doctors had to oppose circumcision. So that's how we got started. But I would like to also say to your listeners, many of whom I think know all this already, but I hope that they will take this information and spread it to 10 other people who don't know it, 10 other women, 10 other young men who haven't maybe given birth yet, and who need to know and need to look into this whole situation before they give birth so that their doctors don't defraud them. Their doctors, of all people, are defrauding people right and left these days, and it's tragic. So I would start by saying that American obstetricians are doing so many things wrong that they really shouldn't be allowed anywhere near a woman in labor. And of course, that means that I'm promoting midwifery, which I think is a wonderful occupation and a very successful way to give birth. In the first place, American obstetricians are doing 30% C-sections. And the World Health Organization is somewhere around 10%. And other people, world experts, are in the order of 6%. That should be the number of C-sections. So we're way over the limit. Then secondly, there are too many inductions of labor. And inductions of labor are done with Pitocin, which is a synthetic drug, when women actually have within them oxytocin, which is the love hormone, and which can be stimulated by stimulating her breast. She can do it herself, or her partner can do it, or someone can do it with her permission. And that will provide exactly the right amount of oxytocin to contract the uterus. And it doesn't need to be given with an injection. Usually. Okay, so then the next thing is episiotomy. Episiotomy was only invented in 1920 by a doctor who was trying to make a name for himself. And he sure did, but unfortunately the tragedy is that he thought it was designed to reduce the risk of serious tearing, but it turns out all the scientific evidence today shows that it increases that risk. So that should not be done, and if it is done now, it can be considered a sexual assault.
Yes, absolutely.
Good. Then another problem with American obstetricians, and I can't, obviously speak for all of them. I'm just speaking for all too many that I know about in the basic situation, the basic problem in America today, which is money, and the money drives hospitals to want lots of C-sections and so on. But doctors do not respect a woman's birth plan. So often you hear, almost every woman who has given birth in a hospital has something terrible to say about it. And that's one of the things. She says, okay, I made this plan with my doctor, and he said, yes, yes, yes. But when it came down to the nitty gritty, he switched the plan and thought he had excuses for it, but didn't necessarily. And it really made it a horrible birth for me. Mm-hmm. Then a very serious problem is cutting the cord early. Nature says that the cord pulsates for about 20 minutes. And what's happening is that the placenta is pulsating that blood into the baby, so he's no longer anemic. It's also helping to shrink the placenta so that it will come off the wall of the uterus much more easily and much more readily than it would otherwise. And so you must wait. People, even today, I mean, those who know this are saying just a couple of minutes, and it's hard to know. If you watch the film masterpiece, Birth as We Know It, you'll find out that the woman didn't cut the cord at all. She put the placenta in a pan and carried the pan and the baby around for several days until nature separated the umbilical cord at the umbilicus just as naturally as can be. I'm not saying that everybody is wanting to do that, but she does say that it was a wonderful experience. And then possibly one of the most important things is empowerment. I've talked to so many women who've given natural births and said, this was the most powerful day of my life. I got this power. And what do they want that power for? What do they need that power for? They need that power to take care of that child for the next 60 years. You can never be a mother. And so when depriving a woman of that by interfering with her birth, by running around the delivery room shouting and screaming and encouraging her to push and all this nonsense, and having bright lights on, is just very destructive and traumatic. It's true that in America, it's believed that about 95% of all births are traumatic and about 45% are severely traumatic. And none of them need to be. You have a water birth and it's not traumatic at all. Yeah. Okay, and last but not least, hardly least, is the fact that doctors, too many doctors in America circumcise the babies if it's a boy. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that they cut off half the skin of a normal penis. Now, what does that mean? Well, in order to really understand this, I think we have to go into detail. What are the uses of the foreskin? The foreskin is there to cover an erection. The penis, doing its most important job, which is to procreate, has to get larger. And in order to get larger, it needs skin to cover that enlarged organ. Where does it come from? It's the foreskin, obviously. Mm-hmm. Then also the foreskin keeps the tip of the penis soft. And this means that the tip of the gland, which is called the glans penis, G-L-A-N-S, penis, the glans penis is no longer, it doesn't get calloused. And this means that it has a delicate mucous membrane on its covering, which is the same covering as the vagina has, so that there's no irritation when sexual intercourse occurs. But you take the foreskin away, the glans gets calloused, and the callus irritates the very delicate mucous membrane of the vagina seriously. And so in America, lots of people use lubricants and think it's natural, but it isn't, of course. The foreskin is tiny in the infant. It's just like a very small, like almost a little bit bigger than a rubber band, perhaps. But in the adult, it's the size of a postcard. So you are really diminishing the size of the penis when you remove this thing. And it's also shorter because there's no room for the penis to erect into. The tissue just isn't there. And maybe another thing that's most important about this, and lastly, is that the ridged bands are removed. The ridged bands were discovered in 1996. They are tiny little ridges in the foreskin, which have all of 80% of the sensitive nerve endings. And so therefore, someone who has their foreskin removed can never experience normal sexual relations. And that is the tragedy, and that is the atrocity that is circumcision.
Yeah. Well, we've covered lots of aspects there, and hopefully we'll unpack all that during our conversation, George. What really strikes me is that this summit has been about birth, but really it's about, in a sense, women's choice. Birthing parents' choices over their bodies. And certainly your original career in facilitating women who wanted to have abortions is definitely part of that. In Australia, where I live, a lot of states abortions are legal, and it's an important part of a woman's capacity for a lot of different reasons to be able to control her reproductive rights. So that's just kind of normal in Australia. In Australia, also where we live, there is still a lot of circumcision, I would think, but probably not as much as America. It's done here electively, but it's not the norm in a sense. Whereas in America, my understanding is that sometimes it even happens in hospitals. The baby is simply taken away from the mum, and the mum's not even told, and then the baby's brought back circumcised. Is that something that you've heard and experienced happen?
I've had all too much experience as an expert witness in a number of cases of that very thing, where the parents absolutely had no say in the thing at all. But then also, I think we can say that with every circumcision in America, there is a lack of informed consent. So that's actually, we're now calling this fraud, and we're planning to sue doctors for fraud on this because it's just it's totally out of hand.
I guess a lot of this conference has been about women's sexuality, because we see in an enlightened view birth as being an inherent part of our sexual experience. And where mothers with little babies, perhaps we aren't prepared mentally to think about our babies as having a future sexuality. But the realistic situation is that they will, and our boys will, and they definitely have a right to experience and explore that full sexuality. And what do you say, I guess, when people say, oh, it's a parent's choice to circumcise or not? I mean, the parents are kind of choosing, in a sense, in my view, how their child 20 years down the track and then for the rest of their lives will experience sex and sexuality. Do you think that's a choice that the parents get to really make?
No, I do not. Parents, unfortunately, don't really have that choice because current medical ethics says that it has to be in the child's best interest. So, of course, that's where the problem is. People who say it's in the child's best interest say the parents can do it. But those who say that clearly circumcision is not in the child's best interest say that they have no right to do that. Mm-hmm. And of course, a doctor who does this, where in medicine does a doctor take advice from a patient as to whether or when to operate? I mean, for cosmetic surgery, yes. But for any other surgery, the doctor has to make that decision. And so the doctors who do this should know better that they are harming their patients. And so every doctor who circumcises is really making a farce out of his entire career because he is deliberately harming his patients. And I consider this a great tragedy for them as well as for for my profession. And, the Gallup polls, which are very reliable polls in America from 1965 to 1995, showed that trust in American doctors went from 95% to 23%. That's a total sea change. And a lot of that was due to hundreds of millions of American parents having their child circumcised and then finding out later that that should never have been done.
So do you want to talk about the difference between medical non-necessity and medical necessity when and how that exists and how maybe a parent can tell the difference?
Well, of course, that's in America. I mean, that depends on, we have an abnormal norm. And so that's the problem. But it's, in most cases, I think it's fairly clear. But I think that circumcision should be very clear, and I hope that it is clear in Australia. In Brisbane, you have the Russell Clinic, by the way, which is notorious worldwide because Terry Russell, who recently retired, claimed that he'd done over 30,000 circumcisions. And, you know, I mean, that's a massive amount of harm. And now, theoretically, the parents wanted that, but who knows how much the very existence of his clinic made them think it was okay. And I think,
Normalized it.
yes, he normalized it, right. And I think that's one of your tragedies. But I know that Australia has fewer circumcisions than we do. Yes.
Yes, it does. And I've heard statistics. I was watching the introduction to the film American Circumcision, which is on Netflix. I'm not sure whether your organization had a role in that, but I was just watching the promo, and a man was saying how the cost to risk benefit in terms of circumcision being like a preventative kind of measure was like 14 to 1. So it just seemed, you know, that when their parents are told to circumcise because down the track maybe their sons, it'll help them avoid UTIs or you know, genital diseases. Is that something realistic that they should believe?
Well, no, unfortunately, that's the tragedy. You're right. American circumcision was supported by us. And in fact, our executive director, a lawyer, John Geisiger, is in the film himself and has a lot to say about it. But you're right. It's not cost effective. There are all kinds of problems that occur after circumcision. 4 pages of complications that have been noted on circumcision. So, you know, it's a total denial of nature. And it's actually blasphemy too, because, you know, God made this thing the way it was. And to think that he didn't know what he was doing is blasphemy.
Mm-hmm. My background, I've mentioned this a little bit on this summit, for example, with our wonderful interview about episiotomy with Dr. Michael Charles Klein. My background initially before motherhood was law, and then doing a master's in human rights law. Didn't finish it, became a mother instead. But it's very clear to me that when we're talking about removing the child's foreskin without their consent, in the same way that episiotomy is a form of genital mutilation when it's not done within, you know, proper medical reasons, the same thing is happening with male circumcision. We should really be approaching male circumcision in the same way as we approach female circumcision. The result is the same. Someone else, a doctor, is controlling, or the family together controlling this other person's experience of their body and their life and their sexuality. And why do you think there is this inhibition between being able to see women, like when women have their genitals changed, that being as mutilation, but when boys have their foreskins cut off, that's not seen as mutilation? Why is this why is there that cognitive dissonance out there today?
Well, that's because women are superior to men, and they can figure it out, and they have figured it out, and they've fought this tremendously, dramatically. And men haven't got it together. You know, it's tragic. And of course, we can blame women for that because they brought us up. I'm kidding. But yes, that's a real serious problem because everybody, it seems, doesn't think well of female genital mutilation, but they are still vociferously defending male genital mutilation. And I don't understand it, really. I have to say I don't know what's going on.
How long will it take to change that paradigm?
Well, my position has always been that the only thing that can make a doctor do this is the law. See, partially, the reason doctors circumcise is because they have a compulsion to do it. And the reason they have a compulsion to do it is because they themselves are victims, often. Almost invariably not. Of course, if women do it, doctors do it, that can't be the case. But in the case of male doctors, they almost all have been circumcised themselves. And so they have this compulsion, and nobody can tell them otherwise. So the only thing that can stop them is the law. And that's what we're working hard on, trying to use to deal with this, because that's the only thing they'll listen to.
What do you say to men who've maybe come to you saying, I was circumcised as a child and I feel like I'm missing something. I feel like there was some kind of sexual experience I was meant to have and I'm not having that. And my parents did this to me and I want to love my parents, but at the same time, I find it difficult to forgive them over this and what they've denied me. What do you say to those men out there who are having that experience and want to transform that?
Well, first, I would apologize to them for my profession doing that to them. Secondly, I would encourage them to forgive their parents for their own sake, not for their parents' sake, and they'll feel much better about things. And then thirdly, I would tell them to consider restoration. You know, it's epithelium stretches, just like if you put a weight on your earlobe, it'll stretch quite a ways, as you know. And so therefore you can stretch the foreskin, and many tens of thousands of men are doing this right now. And of course that in itself should give somebody an indication that this should never have been done in the first place. But stretching the foreskin, stretching a new foreskin into place can do several things to make sexual relations better. It can never restore the ridged bands. They have been removed completely. But it can give some protection to the tip of the penis and so on. And men who restore it are happier. They're also happier doing something about it instead of just putting up with it.
Yeah, and I guess the sensitivity, would they come back a little bit as well, just through the softening?
Yes, that's...
It's a very, very difficult issue, because it is on one hand an education of parents and of course doctors, and then on the other hand you've got to deal with the perspectives of the men that this has been done to, and as you've said, the doctors doing it may have already had it done to them, and you don't know what you don't know. If you don't know that life would have been different if this hadn't have been done to you, and this is just normal, when you want to recreate that normal experience in the next person, but you don't actually have a full comprehension of what is normal, because you've never actually experienced sex and sexuality as an intact, male genitalia. So it's a very difficult issue of how we can heal that. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think most men do recognize subconsciously, if not consciously, that they have been harmed and that they aren't getting a normal experience, but they are also in tremendous denial about this, and with good reason. I don't blame them for that. I mean, that's the natural human protective mechanism. So it's a conflicting situation for them.
Yes, I've seen it. Often I see this question probably 5 times a day on Facebook women's groups, mothers groups, where mothers will say, I'm considering getting circumcision for my son. I don't really want to get it done. It makes me want to cry. But, for this and this and this reason, the doctor or such and such, should I do it? And it's interesting because those are actually the posts in general that get hundreds of responses, and they're all so different. But one of the responses I see quite often is that, we got it done for our son because, daddy didn't want the little boy to grow up and ask daddy, why is my willy different to yours? I just think that's a really interesting reason to get it done, because the child might look at the dad's willy and go, oh, why is my willy different? That's sort of like an opportunity for a conversation rather than a reason to do a circumcision. What would you say to a mother who maybe has a partner who wants the child to be circumcised for that reason? And what would you say to the mother in that instance, and how she could then approach that compassionately with her partner?
Well, that's a very tough question. I've seen women divorce their husbands because of this. And so I don't want to encourage that. But the thing is that I would say protect the child at all costs. And try to bring the man around. And start doing this way in advance too. Many couples spend their whole 9 months of pregnancy discussing this, and keeping the woman keeping her fingers crossed that it's going to work out, at the end. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But if we start suing doctors for fraud, they're going to stop doing it simply because they can't afford to pay to be convicted of fraud. And that's tragic.
Insurance would just go there. Yeah.
You have to do,
Yeah.
by the way, their malpractice insurance won't cover that.
Yeah,
They pay it
exactly.
out of their own pocket. So therefore, we think that has some possibilities.
So if people want to help you with that effort to, you know, in the fraud cases, how can they get involved or support you doing that?
Oh, well, very simply, Doctors Opposing Circumcision is a nonprofit organization in America. We have, you know, very many of them in America. They're some of the best ways that we make progress in America is with nonprofit organizations. And it's called doctorsopposingcircumcision.org. And you can contribute to us, and we will use that money very wisely to deal with some of these new cases that are coming up.
Okay, it's really good to know. Now, one point that you've made is that circumcision, obviously when it's done to the very young infant and they're just imprinting, then inhibits breastfeeding. Do you want to talk about the hows and whys of that?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, women know much more about this than I do, but the thing is that the child has lost trust in the mother. The mother is the only person the child knows at this point in his life, and she's everything to him. And so when he's harmed, when he's hurt, when he's tortured and mutilated, which are words I don't use lightly, but those, if you look in the dictionary, is what's happening. If he's tortured and mutilated, then he's going to be resentful. And so he takes it out on the mother. And so it fouls up breastfeeding dramatically.
Yeah.
You might have something more to add to that. I wish you would.
I've not experienced the difference, having not circumcised my children. And the interesting thing is that whenever anyone discusses breastfeeding issues, it's never mentioned, well, never asked, I don't think. I've never heard it asked on a Facebook group when someone complains about breastfeeding issues, was there a circumcision involved? So I think that more awareness amongst the lactation consultants maybe needs to be asked, maybe needs to occur even for them to even consider that. And then maybe if there was some kind of study done in terms of mothers reporting complications with breastfeeding with young boy babies, if there was kind of correlation between having been circumcised versus not, that'd be a very interesting statistic to explore, I guess, if that's not being done.
It would indeed. And in fact, a recent study did show that SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, is correlated with circumcision. And, you know, in a way,
interesting.
The baby comes into the world. This is a little, this is not scientific now, but the point is the baby comes in the world, he gets harmed like this, and he says, the hell with it, I'm out of here. And who knows to what extent that contributes to him just not having a life wish, you know. His life thrust is shot by this. It's massively tragic what's going on.
Yeah. I guess I was going to say the thrust, but that's a terrible pun at this point. I was going to say the thrust of this summit. It was totally unconscious, but the directionality, the direction of this summit has been about, you know, reclaiming the divine feminine within the birth process. It's the Awaken Your Inner Birth Goddess Summit, right? But for me and my background, my very deep understanding is that as we reclaim the divine feminine, we must also reclaim the divine masculine. And in the same way that I would say the torture and the tragedy occurring to many women being traumatized through the obstetric system at the moment, in the same way as I see that as one of the most grave issues facing humanity, because, you know, it's those mothers, as you say, who have to have that inner strength and inner belief and resourcefulness to take care of that next generation for the next 60 years and bring them in peacefully and do it with, you know, peaceful intentions so that we can as many of the speakers here on the summit have said, they want to create that next generation of peace and equality and sustainability on Earth. I see the mirror to that in why it is so important to birth our children peacefully and to raise them peacefully, is because we have a very distorted masculine in the world right now. The masculine, as we see it, isn't nurturing, it isn't protective, it is destructive, extractive, disconnected. And for many reasons, I see that as not only happening through how we birth our babies, and that's why it's so important to reduce that militarization of culture through, the gentle birthing of our mothers and our babies. But it's also important, how we treat our children. And so the biggest issue, I think, is birth is so important when it's done peacefully, because without it, I think, as you say, the girls, they grow up, they're already nurturing and emotionally connected, they're fine. But it's the boys who need that imprinting of where their compass is, that their compass is love and connection and family and belonging, and anything that we can do to facilitate that in the next generation is so important. And unfortunately, the great tragedy is, it's my cat's tail, the great tragedy is that whenever we do a circumcision, we are, as you've said, we've betrayed that child's trust in a benevolent and generous universe and planet that's here, that they can bond with and that will take care of them, and that they can reciprocate and take care of the planet in return. So I'm really hoping that your work manages to generate enough awareness about this that a critical mass, they want to reclaim that experience of the divine masculine for their sons, and they see that as worthwhile enough, really, to advocate for their children and for other people's children.
Thank you. I have stepsons who are circumcised and stepsons who are not circumcised, and there's a world of difference between them. And I'd also like to say, to add to what you were just saying, that the film Birth as We Know It, which many of your friends know, I know, but I'd love to everybody else who doesn't know about it to know. I'd love to and men need to see this film too. And this is partial answer to your question. If men saw this film, they would begin to understand more about how important it is to have a birth without trauma. These are water births. My friend Elena, I'm proud to be one of the co-producers of this film, by the way. And it's one of the great honors of my life to be involved with that film. And Elena is just totally amazing. And she made this film some 10 years ago, and it's still the film to see if you want to understand how important the beginnings of life are.
Is that the one that goes for half an hour, that's the Russian one, or is that the longer one that was the sequel kind of to that?
I'm not sure about the longer one that's a sequel. Elena's film is at least a half an hour. It's Birth as We Know It. And it also has extra parts to it, like there's the lotus birth in there. It's not a part of the film itself, but it's there in all its detail in the extras. There's a great, I think it's a total of 3 hours of material. And my favorite stories is a 41-year-old woman whose doctor, and she was having her first child, and her doctor was planning a C-section because of that. And she watched, when she was 7 months along, she watched Birth as We Know It 17 times, gave up her doctor, found a midwife, and the midwife said it was the most beautiful experience in her 20 years of practice.
So probably it was the original film that I saw prior to having my second daughter, which was the inspiration for how I birthed her, having, read Ina May Gaskin and then watched this film. I think it's so important when you are planning a natural birth to actually watch births that are natural and easy, and then your body just knows how to do it. Your body somehow just assimilates with that, you know, energetic composition of knowledge of like, yes, I have that capacity because now I've seen it. I know how to copy that mirror neurons kind of thing happening. So yeah, I'm so glad that you were involved in that film. Nicole Moore, who also teaches with Elena.
Yes, I know. Yes, I know.
But she was on, yeah, so Nicole was generous with her time and did an interview here on the Limbic Imprint as well.
Good. Yes.
Well, I guess, do you want to talk briefly about like religion and culture, and when people want to do circumcision or think they need to do circumcision as a religious practice? Do you want to explore that consideration with us?
Yes, thank you. One of our executive vice president is Jewish. Doctors Opposing Circumcision is executive vice president, and he has a website called, it's Brit Shalom, Celibates of Brit Shalom. And Brit Shalom, not many Jews even know what that term means, but it means the ceremony without the cutting. And over 200 rabbis, and of course, possibly many, many other more Reform rabbis are willing to do this. Therefore, it strikes me that if that many rabbis are on board in saying this is not necessary to cut the child, then it's not that essential. And I would also add that, you know, that Jewish scholars have shown that the parts of the Bible that talk about Abraham were written at least 200 years after he was dead. So therefore, anybody can make up anything they want after 200 years. And so we have no real sense of the actual truth of any of these statements. And so that compounds to me the tragedy that so many people think it's so important to do something that may have been made up by somebody who was resentful.
Exactly. It's, I just can't believe any God would want any child, any good God would want any child harmed. I just can't see that in any good God's plan. And
especially since he made it in the first place.
Yeah.
As far as the Muslims are concerned, you know, there's nothing in the Quran about circumcision, nothing at all. So they'd say, oh, yeah, but there's these other things that are made. But those other things are made by human beings. They're just like you and me. They chose to go into the clergy, so to speak. And but then they made these pronouncements which affect billions of people. Well, I say, sorry, but you don't have that authority.
And that's also a really good question. I think people are becoming more aware of it, that regardless of the circumstances that gave rise to the stories in the Bible that occurred, how they actually got written down and then transmitted, you know, the Chinese whispers and the different intentions through the centuries, you know, we can still believe in God and still believe in a lot of these, obviously the miracles and the stories that take place, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to believe the bad bits, because, you know, we have to understand culture and how culture operates and how culture transmits itself. And, you know, there's a lot of different things that that sort of get woven in as to promote the, you know, in the same way that how Christianity adopted a whole lot of Roman traditions to get the Romans on board with Christianity. In the same way that can happen through any time. In order for it to meld with the local population and get accepted there, you sometimes change the story so it sounds more appealing to the local population, and they, you know, come on board. So there's a whole lot of ways stories and culture gets transmitted, and we can still believe in God and consider ourselves as, you know, followers of spirituality or religion without necessarily doing these things that we don't really know why they started or how. I mean, anthropologically, there's a lot of indication and instances of, you know, circumcision sometimes being done in cultures where there needs to be a certain militarization of the boys and the men into soldiers who protect their, you know, their communities. But so we don't necessarily need that anymore. We're not a culture where we are having to go to war all the time to defend ourselves from the people over the hill, you know. We live in peace now, generally, in our culture.
Yes, one of the things about that is if you circumcise your army, then they're going to fight to the death, because if they get captured, they can be identified and then they'll be put to death anyway. So why not fight to the death? So that's a lovely.
How interesting.
There are also, of course, some very extraordinary stories in the Bible relating to circumcision. One of the most interesting is the story of King David. You know, David, of course, slew Goliath and became very popular, and King Saul was jealous of him. And so when David wanted to marry King Saul's daughter, Saul said, well, you go get me 100 Philistine foreskins and I'll let as a dowry, and I'll let you marry my daughter. And Saul actually had in mind that David would get killed. So David gets his army together and goes out and kills 200 Philistines, takes off their foreskins, brings them back to Saul, and gets to marry his daughter. Lovely dowry, isn't it? So
yes,
that's a little, you know, we hopefully have come a little ways since then.
Yeah. And that story really puts it in light what the real intention and nature behind circumcision really is, isn't it? Yeah. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time today, George. It's been a very enlightening conversation. We've talked about a lot of different things. And so if people have followed us all the way through the end, thank you for sticking with us, because we know this is a hard conversation to have, and we know that you and I, George, have probably come to it after maybe obviously decades of consideration. It's not something that just popped into our heads overnight. It's that, you know, a lot of different things have come together for us to help us understand the practice in the lights that we do. So thank you for being here. Good luck with your organization. And do you want to tell people, you've told them the website, is there any social media that people can follow you on? Is that something you do?
Well, I'm not personally active on Facebook, but we do have a lot of people active on it, yes. And so you can see us there. But come to our website,
I guess just
opposingcircumcision.org.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. I've got one last question for you before we go. And that is, George, how do you see the world as being in the future if no circumcision was done anywhere ever? How would the world be different?
Much happier. Absolutely much happier. And that's what we're moving in that direction. There's a wonderful, humans are moving, making great progress in everywhere you look. It's just that we don't know it, because the news doesn't like, good news doesn't sell. Bad news sells. So therefore, but if you look at the statistics, we are making tremendous progress in all directions. It's really quite remarkable. If you want more on that, it's a book called Enlightenment Now by Harvard professor Steven Pinker. Documents all of the progress that we've made as humans.
Fantastic. I can only see us going good places from here. I think that humans and humanity, we've got some issues to deal with based on our past interactions and relationships with the world and each other. We've got a lot of cleaning up to do, but I guess that's us graduating our evolutionary childhood and coming into adolescence and maturity. And part of being a mature being is always knowing how to clean up after ourselves. So that's probably the task at hand.
I agree. Yeah. I agree.
Thank you for everything that you're doing in that effort towards, you know, healing the past, healing the future. And I wish you and your organization the best of luck. And thank you for being with us, George.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the Learning to Birth Summit. You can follow us at Learn to Birth on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So see you next time.